The Navy isn't quite certain how many ships and submarines it wants to build over the next few decades. In fact, it's offered 3 alternative plans to Congress with varying timelines and price tags. For analysis, we turn to the Senior Analyst for Naval Forces at the Congressional Budget Office, Eric Labs. Mr. Labs, good to have you with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And you have studied this extensively, and I guess my first question is, and we're going to get to the shipbuilding capacity of the United States, but Navy warships by statute, if I'm correct, must be built in the United States. Is that correct?
That's correct. Congress requires that Navy warships be built in U.S. shipyards. And they even take it a little bit further than that. They do have on the books laws to make sure that the content the shipyards use to build those ships is mostly American-made as well, and looking to increase that in the future, that content.
Yes, because I guess in the Coast Guard there are a couple of vessels, classes that are made, I think, by a Finnish contractor and so forth, but those are not warships. They're some other type of vessel. Let's get to the plans, and you present 3 alternative plans because that's what Navy presented to Congress and for CBO to evaluate. What is their strategy in presenting 3 alternative plans with different mixes of vessels in each of those plans?
Honestly, that is not very clear. It is not very clear to me. It's not very clear to the Congress. This phenomenon that you describe of multiple plans in their shipbuilding report started last year with 2023. They had 3 plans last year. First plan, buy a little less than 300 ships, emphasize surface combatants a little bit more than submarines, move to new generation ships fast. The second plan, which was actually put together by the Office of Secretary of Defense's CAPE, its analytic unit, it was going to emphasize submarines a little bit more than surface combatants, and it would emphasize building more of existing classes of ships and fewer of next generation ships. And those 2 alternatives were going to be under a fiscal constraint, basically the same amount of money that the Navy is getting for shipbuilding that it is getting today. Then the third plan is, well, if you give the Navy some more money, what does it do for it? Well, in that third alternative, it would buy a little bit more of everything, although not quite as many submarines as alternative 2. And the idea behind this, I guess, is to sort of give ideas of sort of what would be the trade-offs that you can buy with, fixed amounts of money, or if you had more money, what can you buy? The problem is I don't think the Congress really knows what to do with these 3 alternative plans. The statute implies that they should be submitting 1 plan, not 3.
Interesting. And because you would think that the plan of the mix of the ships should start not from here's different dollar volumes, but here's what the strategy is of the Navy for defending the nation, and that should derive from the Quadrennial Defense Review and the other documents that are out there. Shouldn't that be the driver and not some kind of a Chinese menu, if you will, of here's what we could do?
Well, I think there's 2 ways I want to answer that question. One is, to some degree, at a very broad level, it does do that. The Navy is not going to put a shipbuilding plan out there that is, radically at variance with what the national defense strategy is of the United States. That being said, the Navy admits directly in this shipbuilding plan, in its cover letter and in the document itself, that, okay, the plan in 2024 is a holdover of 2023. It has not been aligned to the national defense strategy that was put out in 2022. We're going to do that. We're going to align the Navy shipbuilding plan in the fiscal year 2025 budget and shipbuilding plan with that national defense strategy. So does that mean in 2025 in February, when this budget and shipbuilding plan comes over, we'll have 1 plan and not 3? I hope so, because it's a lot of work for me to do 3 plans rather than 1, but I don't know. So it's not clear.
And just on the budget itself, what is the variation in the costs of the various plans? And in general, what percentage of the Navy budget and of the defense budget do they represent? My quick summary look at your report sounds like it's about 5% of the total defense budget.
Right. In terms of shipbuilding, it's only going to be, a relatively small amount, about 5%, as you say. In terms of the total cost of the plans, by CBO's estimate, it would cost about anywhere from $33 to $36 billion on average every year for the next 30 years to implement any one of these plans. And the range, of course, is depending on which plan you're talking about. And that's a large amount of money. We have not spent that much money on Navy shipbuilding for that long period of time in our nation's history. So these are challenging plans that the Navy, is putting forward for people to consider.
We're speaking with Eric Labs. He's Senior Analyst for Naval Forces and Weapons at the Congressional Budget Office. And besides the number of vessels, there's also what those vessels can do. And that's got to figure somehow into the equation, because if one ship costs X, but it can launch 30% more missiles, and the other ship costs X minus 10%, but it doesn't have that capability, that has to complicate the trade-off questions.
Absolutely. And a lot of people do fixate on sort of the total number of ships in the fleet or the total number of ships that we're buying. But you're absolutely right that the composition of that fleet, the composition of those ships that we're buying and what those individual ships can do, the capabilities they bring to the fleet matter a great deal more than, say, like an overall, numerical count. One of the things that the Navy did do in its shipbuilding plan last year when it first introduced these three plans is it introduced some measures of capability that we could look at and compare the plans in an unclassified format. The Navy does a lot of its analysis in classified like campaign models and things like that. We can't really understand that, but the number of missile cells, the number of sorties the fleet can launch, these are measures that they put into their shipbuilding plan to try and facilitate comparison. The problem with that is that they didn't give much guidance or headlights or signals to the Congress to say, well, what does this mean? What can Alternative 2 do better than Alternative 1 can do, and so forth? They showed these measures of comparison without giving any guidance as to sort of what they mean and how to use them.
And continuous published reports talk about how China is churning out a navy and almost like faster than Carnival Cruise Lines. They've got maybe not quite as capable or quite as good, but then, there's the doctrine thought that there is strength in just sheer numbers, even if they're less capable. They can swarm and so on, surround Taiwan or whatever the case might be, which gets me to the question of the defense industrial base. For whatever the Navy would like to do, is there the industrial capacity? And if Congress decided, well, maybe we ought to accelerate this and do it in 20 years or 10 years, given the threat situation, could the nation actually fulfill those orders?
To accelerate this shipbuilding plan, in other words, to say like, Alternative 1 builds 290 ships, to try and build those 290 ships in 15 or 20 years, as opposed to over 30 years, that's not really possible with the industrial capacity that we have today. Right now, the submarine industrial base, which is the one weapon system in the fleet that everyone agrees that we need more of them as fast as we can get them. Submarine industrial base is already currently at its limit because of all the things that they've had to do in terms of buildup of new replacement ballistic missile submarine, building up 2 attack submarines per year. They can't really do much more. Now, the Navy's going to invest heavily into that submarine industrial base, billions and billions of dollars that will go into to increase that capacity. But that's going to take 5 to 10 years before we bear fruit to be able to build more than what we're already building today. And that's going to be true for across a lot of other types of combatants as well. There's some slack in some categories, but a lot of it is, we don't have the industrial capacity to compete with China's rate of shipbuilding right now.
Right. There's only one builder of these submarines, and there's no 6 companies that can compete for each tranche of subs.
The way we build submarines is that there are actually 2 submarine builders, but they each only build about half of an attack submarine. And then they ship those sections to each other for alternating final assemblies of those submarines. To build a nuclear-powered submarine would require a huge investment, like $15 to $20 billion to build a new shipyard that could actually produce those submarines, and take probably 15 to 20 years to get that really up and running. So yes, with respect to submarines especially, we're stuck with the shipbuilders that we have. Now, there are things that the Navy is doing to help that. There are sections of submarines they're starting to farm out to other shipyards and other companies. They build a deck here, they build a compartment there, and they start incorporating that into sort of a one nation as one shipyard, if you will. So the Navy's going down that direction very strongly because they recognize they have to. They can't meet the demand signal without doing that because they don't have other yards that can build the submarines.
Eric Labs is Senior Analyst for Naval Forces and Weapons at the Congressional Budget Office. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
And we'll post this interview along with a link to his report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.